Hi everyone and welcome back to the Teentake. I'm your host Kavya Bhardwaj and today we're doing something very exciting. We're officially leveling up the show by introducing an interview concept and we're going to be asking him some very insightful questions. We are moving past just talking about the news to actually dissecting it with someone who knows the science behind the headlines. And today we're tackling the massive shift in India's space industry, specifically how our country has officially entered the private sector orbital rocket game. Keep me walking at the same time when we get high. To understand why this is such a big deal, we have to look at the transition we are currently witnessing. For a long time, everything space related in India was led entirely by ISRO, a governmental space agency in India. That government run model has been incredibly successful, but now we're seeing a shift to a more dynamic setup where private companies are finally getting a seat at the table. Essentially, the government is battling that private startups can move faster and spark breakthroughs more efficiently than traditional agencies. It is a bit like a model we saw with SpaceX in the US, which really shook up the industry by proving that private firms could handle orbital launches with rapid testing and new technology. However, India is doing this in its own way. We aren't just copy pasting the Western model, our startups are focusing on extreme cost efficiency and homegrown engineering, which keeps our national identity at the center of the mission. When we talk about the economics, though, things get complicated. For context, we have to consider the quote unquote opportunity cost, right? Which is basically the trade off we see between two things. While these advancements are exciting, we have to weigh the resources put into high tech aerospace against immediate social needs like healthcare or local infrastructure. It brings up a big ethical question, which is that is it right to prioritize space tech and how do we balance that with the realities of daily life for the average person? So, to understand and to gain a better insight, I am interviewing Aryan. And let's see how that goes. Hi, Aryan, how are you doing?
Hey, all's going well. So,
That's amazing.
yeah.
So, before we actually begin the interview, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how passionate you are in this area of studies?
So, hey, I'm Aryan. I am very interested in multiple things. My top interests include software. I also edit the teentake episodes. I'm into eco as well. I'm into math. I'm just into a lot of things. But I'm definitely very deep and I just have a lot of fun working with rocketry. I am leading the school rocketry club and we work on a bunch of cool rockets there, a lot of designing. And of course, I also enjoy watching rocket launches and keeping up with the updates going on in the rocketry field. And boy, what an exciting time.
So Aryan, let's dive right in. For those of us trying to wrap our heads around, this aerospace side, what fundamentally changes in the physics and engineering process when a rocket goes from suborbital testing to a full orbital insertion? And how does that, how can a startup handle that risk differently than a governmental organization like ISRO?
Ooh, that's a very good question. So, I'd first want to start off with the challenges of suborbital launch in general. When it comes to attaining orbital velocity around Earth, you need approximately 7.8 kilometers per second of velocity. That is, you need to be able to go from Bangalore to Mysore. That's 150 kilometers in 20 seconds. that is about how fast you need to go. 7.8 kilometers
That's insane.
every second. And so, here is the thing. If you have just raw fuel, you just have one big giant fuel tank, that's impractical because A, you need a lot of fuel. It is generally just not the best economic decision. So you got to have multiple stages. You need to have flight computers that detect when one stage is empty and then on sequence, on its own, detach that stage and then ignite the second stage. There's just, generally speaking, a lot of things that can go wrong with rocketry. So much so that when you design in rocketry, you don't think of what can go right. You think of, quote unquote, what could possibly go wrong because, well, there's just so many failure points when it comes to that. And that is just for aerospace in general. When you get to private aerospace, you've got a lot higher risk. When it comes to governmental organizations, you have a steady stream of funding from tax money and so on. But when it comes to a private firm, getting funding is incredibly difficult. So you need to be able to use every last resource you have to the fullest. You need to be able to test very deeply, all to make sure that nothing goes wrong. Because if something goes wrong, not only is it sad for all the scientists and everyone who worked on it, it's economically speaking just a waste of those resources.
Correct.
They are not used to the maximum utility they could have, effectively speaking.
Correct. And won't you say that there's also an advantage of a startup doing it better than a governmental organization, because they don't really need to justify why taxes or why another person's money is going into the space race?
That is true. You don't have to justify as much, and that comes closer to the PR side of things. But generally speaking, even if a government organization, let's say they launch a rocket and it goes south. All right, the government can mention things like failure-based design, that they will do better next time, and that all of that, right? Which, fair enough, rocketry is very difficult. But when it comes to a private space tech firm, that's basically all the funding you're gonna get. It's unlike many of these public space tech firms where you might be able to get a specific amount of funding or a more steady amount of funding. When it comes to private space tech firms, especially if something is venture capital backed, you'll lose shareholder support. And that shareholder support goes straight back into your funding, which is less so in terms of a government organization, because you'll get taxes anyway. You won't get investors back as easily.
Yeah, that makes sense. So now let's compare it to a private corporation like SpaceX in the US and how, private companies commercialize low Earth orbit in the US. So what that brings me to is that, do you think that Indian firms can replicate that rapid iteration model here, or are we facing a completely different set of structural and financial constraints? We often hear about comparisons to SpaceX and how private companies commercialize low Earth orbit in the US. Do you think Indian private firms can replicate that rapid iteration model here, or are we facing a completely different set of structural and financial constraints?
All right. That's a good point. And it's good that you mentioned financial constraints here, because especially when an aerospace company is starting up, financials can be a slightly challenging issue to start out with. When it comes to SpaceX, and especially a lot of the Starlink launches recently, where they, as you rightly pointed out, followed a very rapid iteration model. They just build satellites as fast as possible and just launch them. And that way quality could be very slightly compromised, because you're just mass producing so much, and that in that case, the loss of one satellite doesn't matter if you're launching maybe 200 or 300, right? So in that context, I think maybe far in the future, this could hold a lot of promise, especially once let's say Skyroot is making a lot more revenue, and there are a lot more space tech firms, I think, in the works, either as student clubs, as a lot of like additional rocketry startups, university clubs.
Up and coming,
just generally up and coming. So I think the Indian space tech market could be something that is very rapidly growing right now and could, again, continue to grow over time. When it comes to financial structural constraints, yes, there's a few legal aspects in. Like, one example is the Explosives Act of 1884, I believe. I'll correct this in editing if not, but 1884. And in that case, a lot of propellant is regulated, and you need to get additional permits and stuff.
Right.
When it comes to the US, by contrast, they have adopted rocketry more as a hobby. So there's L1 certification, there's level 1 certification, then there's specific motor types you can use, and generally rocket motors are just a lot more available in rocketry. I would say there's more resources available for student rocketry there. I'm not sure how much of this would carry forward to actual rocketry firms, but yeah, we are facing a lot of financial constraints, I would say, right now. But that, again, could change 20 years in the future. You never know.
Yeah, correct. Especially the growth and potential that we're seeing in India, I definitely think that more and more people are willing to contribute to this very promising market, right?
Yeah, I'd agree.
Yeah. So what you're saying is it's largely just legality and lifestyle differences in terms of the structural change. You're not really saying that that perhaps transcends to the bigger players in when it comes to the space industry, right?
I don't think it should. In terms of legalities and legal regulations, I've only experienced them when, for example, working in the Rocketry Club. When we planned to build our own motors, we ran into this issue specifically. But
Right.
yeah, I would assume there are a lot more general regulations, a lot of stuff about national security, probably.
Correct.
And a lot of that might be actually involved in this case, right? So,
Makes sense. So now looking at it from a resource allocation standpoint and more of the economics lens, when private ventures tap into national infrastructure or policy backing, how do we actually justify the capital spent on space tech versus terrestrial development without completely sounding tone deaf and like apathetic to immediate social needs?
all right, Kavya, I would like to respond to this question with a counter question. I don't have figures for
Okay.
India, but how can we justify spending 18%, at least in the US, 18% of the US economy on defense, when we could rather spend that on building hospitals, for example, even when the space tech budget, by the way, is about 30 times less than the US military budget. So,
But maybe that's perhaps because of the fact that military can be seen as a requirement for countries, right? Because it is a threat to their sovereignty. Whereas with space, it's not something that is a necessity for a lot of countries. So maybe because of the way people perceive space and the fact that they don't believe so much should be going into, quote unquote, hobby or just an experiment, how do we, work towards that?
honestly, I'd say at this point, learning more about space as a whole can be one of those things that will help us, like, benefit, that will in turn benefit life on Earth. The same way how defense technologies, like, a lot of technological evolution, especially during the world wars, like, we got radios
Right.
from the world wars, we got motorbikes, we got better automobiles from the world wars because of this sort of race to sort of improve technology.
The Cold War, yeah.
Sort of the Cold War, the World Wars, where having a technological advantage over the other party could mean a lot. So that is one of the things, and that obviously continued to benefit us. Like, for example, radio communication, if I give that as an example. And then that eventually turned into television and mobile phones and all of that, which, of course, have benefited us. In a similar way, I believe space technology can do a very similar thing. Like, if you heard about Mission Moxie, I think that was in 2020 or so, where we aimed to turn carbon dioxide in Mars's atmosphere back into oxygen. And that might help, especially with global warming and stuff, it might help as a technological solution to climate change and all of that. Of course, there's a lot more of, and a fair share of space innovations that honestly could be used. But again, space is just very similar to military, just pushing the boundaries of technology, and pushing those boundaries of technology will again in turn continue to benefit us further going down the line.
Yeah,
So,
I couldn't agree more. I feel like we definitely need to look at it through a technocentric approach, and just like how we view education as an asset to the economy, space is also obviously a subset of education, because we're trying to figure out through trial and error what works and how we can have solutions to global issues via space as a medium, right?
Yeah, I'd say
Yeah.
that's pretty much. Okay, I can't say that's pretty much.
Just give a conclusion, Aryan, just to say like
Overall, generally speaking, I'd say India's space tech market at this point is just very, very promising, and I'm just gonna be following it, and I can see just a lot more like private firm space tech players just stepping their game up, maybe working with ISRO just the same way as how SpaceX right now is working with NASA, and just how the way Microsoft and stuff started up in Bangalore being very reminiscent of, let's say, reminiscent of Silicon Valley's growth in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s. I can see this being very reminiscent of how SpaceX started up today, and maybe if we look at the history that SpaceX and NASA went through in their collaborations, just using SpaceX-based rockets to be able to launch stuff made by NASA, and the collaboration between the private sector and the public sector. I can see this going places, like just not like in a world where we have ISRO, we have Skyroot, we have a lot more firms just all working together on like major space tech projects, and I think that is how we evolve when we combine the private and the public sector. So
Yes.
yeah, despite the barriers, I would genuinely really cool to see an orbital launch by again a private SpaceX firm, which honestly is very difficult, and props to them. Like,
Yeah,
that's amazing.
Definitely. What do you think? How do you imagine India in the next 20 years in the context of space?
All right, we have Company A and ISRO. They collaborate and decide to make a reusable moon lander, which lands on the moon, drops off people, decides to come back to Earth, refuel, do all of that. We have
In the next 20 years itself? Wow.
Sure, why not? I mean, India's doing Gaganyaan in like 2020, is doing Gaganyaan like very soon. They've been working on it quite
Yes.
a lot, and I'd say the next step after Gaganyaan, or after, getting people into space, might be getting people into the moon. Of course, I don't know ISRO's mission schedule, but yeah, I would love to see that. I'd like to see a lot of private public sector just one benefiting the
Merging.
other, for example, and like the extra technological evolution, the new perspectives that private sector would bring into a well-established, well-funded, and already a very strong public sector aerospace environment that India has.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, this was a very, very insightful conversation. Thank you so much, Aryan. It was
Thanks for
great
having
talking
me.
to you, and I hope our listeners, learned something from it.
Guys, also I'm editing the videos. Please watch it. It's up. All right, now to procrastinate 2 weeks on editing this thing.
Oh God, I'm gonna cry.
Thank you, Aryan, for that amazing, very insightful, and super informative conversation. I think that ultimately the goal of this, entire conversation that we had is just to bridge the gap between the complex science and the real world impact. It is incredibly important that we as teenagers actually care about these developments. It's easy to get lost in the noise of social media or the daily pressures of exams and extracurriculars, but these moments of innovation are defining the world we are about to inherit. We often succumb to the pressure of just focusing on our own narrow path, but staying informed about these shifts, whether they're technological, economic, or ethical, is what turns us from passive observers into active participants in the future. So don't just scroll past the headlines. Actually ask the hard questions, because the decisions being made today in labs in government offices are the ones that will shape our reality tomorrow. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode. Bye bye.